And so there's really cool stuff that the developers are building, but then it kind of collides with the real world. And you guys are here to help those things that are colliding with the real world actually survive the collision, in my mind, or to be able to even prosper in the real world. So go through with a quick introduction, and then if you could give me like one example of what you see as an exotic, and then we'll start to get into the frameworks. Grant, we'll start with you again, and then we'll move to this side.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks. So I'm Grant Fondo, co-founder and head of Goodwin's blockchain and digital currency group. I'm also a former federal prosecutor. To give you my sense of perspective on these, so I represent a number of companies in this space who have less traditional forms of structures, as well as represent certain players, former board members, et cetera, with some of these. So that's Tezos, Kik, Telegram, part of the Libra project, et cetera. So I have that sort of perspective, both from a historic as well as going forward. What I would say about the exotic products is, I think you need to think through about why you're doing it. There are, in my mind, many people come to me to set them up in the context of how do I shield myself from liability? How do I protect the company from regulators? That is one exotic product. There's, in some ways, that's almost impossible to build in the US unless you keep money out of the US and unless you keep your presence out of the US. So you can be as exotic as you want, but if you're flowing money in and out of the US, that exotic structure sort of falls by the wayside. The other issue is tax issues, as well as tax benefits. And in some ways, I think I would tell people focus more on that. Unless you're sure you want to be totally offshore from a particular country, focus more on that than I would sort of the elaborate structure. There are benefits to some of these structures. I think it's a really cool concept of true decentralization. You don't have an executive, et cetera. And I think that can work for some entities. But you also have to give up control, and you have to give up certain financial benefits. And so it's all a cost-benefit analysis. And I think there's some, this is a technology that lends itself to DAOs, associations where you wouldn't normally think of them in the context and other exotic structures. So I think it's kind of a fascinating question, but it's not an easy answer.
Okay, good start. I want to come back to the tax stuff, because that actually is relevant to Bermuda in a particular way, which we'll come back to. Let's go to Matthew, and then we'll go to Natalie. Or do you want to go first, Natalie?
Either or.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Always me first.
Ladies first.
Exactly. So, I mean, just touching on what Grant said, I think as a person providing legal advice to some of these providers of exotic frameworks and structures, is a sort of consistent theme, and that's the challenge of decentralization versus regulation, which in itself needs to attach to something, so to an entity. So for example, were you to do a DAO in Bermuda, and I know we can talk about whether or not the correct structure for that would be some sort of limited liability vehicle, which is what we touched upon before. Otherwise, every member of that DAO has unlimited liability, and Stan made that point about Coca-Cola earlier on. It's a very good point. But the point is that in Bermuda, the regulator needs to find an entity to regulate. And so whether or not you put it in a company, whether you put it in an LLC, which would give you more flexibility to give effect to what the organization actually wants in terms of governance and tokenization, it's still going to come within that regulatory overreach, because in Bermuda, if you conduct any kind of digital asset business activity as defined under DABA, they'll force you to do it through a company or through an LLC, and in either way, the regulatory regime will apply. So what we see is, as you correctly said, is looking at those structures and saying, okay, we have a fit for purpose framework in Bermuda, but it does touch on a wide variety of digital assets business activities. So chances are, however exotic your structure is, if you're coming to do it in Bermuda, then it will be caught by one of the regulations, and we'll still have to go through finding that regulatory supervisory touch point. So.
Okay. Matt?
So hi, I'm Matt Ebbs-Brewer. I'm a partner at Appleby, also in Bermuda. And I think from my perspective, what's particularly interesting is touching on, again, the point about why are you doing it? And then the extension for that is, how are you going to do it? Like, we've had some really exotic ideas of people come to us saying we're going to do asset-backed projects, and then it's like, well, that's great. Love your enthusiasm, love the sound of your project, sounds absolutely fantastic, but how are we going to do that from a Bermuda perspective so that investors are comfortable that what you are offering them is actually a product that they are wanting to invest in and they can be comfortable investing in?
You mean from the consumer side?
From the consumer, well, both from the consumer side and the entrepreneur's perspective. And I think from my perspective, what's exciting for me is how can I take an idea that sounds exotic when you get that first call, it sounds great, you're like, yes. And then I'm like, but how am I going to make that happen for the client? And what I think is great and what we're finding really exciting is we're taking existing concepts from the legal framework that have been long-standing, stand the test of time. Trust law in Bermuda, for example, is fantastic, and how we can make those products exotic.
Yeah, so I think that is quite interesting because there is more and more talk about trusts, and Bermuda has been a global center for trusts. We have a trust here. How do you see trusts fitting into this framework? And this may be more on the Bermuda side, but I don't know how it fits in the US. But how do you see trusts becoming could trust become a kind of catch-all thing that would be able to house a wide variety of exotics?
Potentially, and I think Matt mentioned that the use of the trust, I think you described it earlier as being retooled to lend itself to these exotic frameworks. The BMA and government has just brought about some amendments to Bermuda's Digital Assets Business Act that will catch any trustee or fiduciary who is holding digital assets on behalf of other people. There are some exemptions to the licensing requirement that would apply as a result of that, and those exemptions would include where a qualified custodian was appointed by the fiduciary or trustee to actually hold those assets. So what they're worried about is making sure that the person that has safeguarding and safekeeping of the digital asset has the requisite qualifications to do it, and so they'll be looking at who actually is holding those digital assets and that they have the relevant skills and expertise to do it. So it is possible in Bermuda, but again, it touches DABA.
So
Yeah,
when you say that,
just-
is that a trust company or or a person who has a trust, an entity with a trust?
That would be the trust company, the provider of the trust, yeah,
Okay.
the trust company.
Right, okay.
So if I could just follow up on Matt's point, in the U.S., there are trust entities. They're typically more in the finance banking world, and people are using it in an exotic way. You have startup companies who never would have crossed my mind 5 years ago to be thinking about, is this a regulatory path for me, that are doing just that. They're taking sort of these existing structures and doing it and looking at it in a very different way. So I think, and we are seeing what I would call more traditional startups use that type of mechanism or other mechanisms that exist in a non-traditional way.
Is there an opportunity for, let's just call it like an exotic management layer in this world? Because if the world that we're all talking about is essentially tokenized, and if you're tokenizing vegetables at Aero Farm and you're doing air flight credits for, we have a company here that does private aviation and they're doing it through a token. Like if eventually everything becomes tokenized, it doesn't seem possible that the regulator can regulate everything. Like not everything can be I just don't see how regulators will be able to handle that deluge of like work. I mean, I think that's already an issue here in Bermuda and in other jurisdictions where regulators already were overburdened with the financial services industry, and then now there's imagine if we tried to regulate the internet in its early days and all those startups, this is kind of version 2.0, but with a layer of regulation. Do you think there's and if there is, what would it look like for there to be an exotic regulatory management layer that prevented or that solved the regulatory issue for downstream assets? Does that make sense? Is it possible?
Well, I'll start, I guess. Yeah, it makes sense. I think the issue, maybe it's more possible in Bermuda than in the U.S. In the U.S., you have so many different federal jurisdictions as well as federal agencies that seek to have jurisdiction over various types of digital assets, as well as you have a lot of state regulators. So you've got 50 different state regulators to deal with. I think the problem is whether that exotic management agency would be sophisticated enough to be able to handle the exotic product, and are you just adding another layer of bureaucracy that you have to go through, and will it slow it down? So, and also, who are they managing? Is it at the federal level? Is it a unified 50-state exotic management, association, if you will, or government entity? So I think from a practical perspective, it's probably going to be pretty difficult in the U.S. to do that.
Okay.
I think from my perspective, it's the sense of kind of almost alluding to Natalie's point of it's finding the right touch points. You want exotic products that are appropriately regulated, and it's about thinking where is it that we need to be looking in the structures. Obviously, you have, for example, a tokenized asset, and that's great. We're looking at how we're going to regulate the issue of the token itself, but then where are the vegetables? And how are they being protected? And how do we get comfortable? Is that a case of, in order to get the regulation for issuing the token, that's part of the story to the regulator of, here's why this token is appropriate, because here's the custody arrangements, for example, that we have.
Yeah, I think you have to look at a few things. So first of all, what is the activity that is being undertaken, and what is its purpose? If you're tokenizing for internal purposes or for business purposes, there's nothing that a regulator can touch. So are you providing services or selling digital assets to the general public, which the regulator is concerned with and needs to make sure that they need to be protected where necessary. So again, it comes back down to is there an entity that they can regulate? So I don't think there is a world in which they would have to regulate the tokenization of all assets. It's just assets that are being commercialized for sale to the public where there is a need for the public to be protected, and I think that's where their focus is.
So that's like a really important distinction, because this idea of like tokenizing for internal use, like, so let's say you want to tokenize your supply chain for internally versus tokenizing for outward sale, right? Because you're not necessarily going to sell off the parts of your supply chain. Although, there are, use cases out there where the custody or ownership could transfer hands along the supply chain. So I suppose that would fall to the regulatory side.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's just internal versus external.
Exactly. The regulators are there to protect investors and customers. So, if a business chooses to tokenize its supply chain, and that's a complete disaster, that's not something the regulator needs to be concerned about unless it's, it affects a regulated entity such as an insurance company, for example. So I think in each case, as a lawyer, it's a super interesting place to be active, because you're looking at the regulatory touch points. But it's, again, when you look at these exotic structures and tokenization of assets, you still have an asset that needs to be legally held or is legally held by something. And so you're still looking at questions of ownership, and what that means in this new world is obviously up for exploration. So it's super interesting. And we're seeing imaginative tokenization of assets. So it's now moved away from, financial instruments, bonds, shares, securities, investment contracts, to things like pensions annuities is something that we were approached with. So it blows your mind. It's a really fun place.
It's sort
to
of
be
anything and everything now. Healthcare records. So I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we've been talking about tokenization and digital assets, say securities, for a couple years now. So I want to push you guys harder and farther deeper into the jungle. Like, what are the undiscovered species? Like, I feel like everything is focused on tokenization right now, but it's all evolving so quickly. Like 5 years ago, tokenization barely even registered as a thing. Now I'd say it's dominant, like it's replaced cryptocurrencies as the dominant thing. But like, it's evolving. Like, do you have any sense of like what's next? Like, what do I need to be figuring out? What do we all need to be figuring out for after the tokenization wave? What's the wave after that? Do we have any sense of what it is?
Oh,
it's a hard one, because I've been thinking about it for a year. I don't know.
I mean, for me, I'm super excited by what the blockchain can do in terms of its handling of data, but I'm also interested about the power of AI and how that takes over, human control of, again, entities and regulation of entities. So if you're a regulator and you're looking at the management layer that you're talking about, what happens if that is an artificial layer, an artificial intelligence layer, and how do they get their hands around that? So, that's a super exciting area of development that I expect to see a lot more around, and the regulation potentially of AI and data analytics, because I think that's the next kind of wave, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, like, how do you regulate a virus? Like, in a virus that's designed to make money. Like, that's certainly coming. That would be exotic. Matt?
And scary.
I think for me, it's use case. I mean, a lot of these ideas, are fantastic. I say people come to us all the time with, I'm going to tokenize this, and when you say, but what's the use case? And what I'm interested to see is, what's the use case for me? In law firms, what are we going to be using blockchain for? And not just law firms, but professional firms more broadly. It's great to say, look, here's a blockchain, we can put this on the blockchain, we can check it against, all these computers worldwide. Brilliant. What does that mean for me? And I'm seeing a lot of thought pieces coming out where people are saying, okay, in a law firm, in an accountancy firm, here's what blockchain means for you. And for me, it's going to be interesting to see what happens as a result of that uptake by these professional firms to see if that really changes the way we do business.
Okay, Grant?
I would say, I'm not sure this is a particularly new concept, but I don't think we've seen it come out yet. I think it's the democratization of assets. So we've talked about it in the art world. We all would love to own a Picasso. Most of us don't have $50 million laying around. But would we put in $1,000 to buy a piece of that Picasso? And if you have that digital Picasso coin, and there's only, can't do the math, but let's say there's 10,000 of those coins. That's kind of interesting. If you're a real estate person and you could buy a part of Times Square or the New York Times building or whatever famous icon, and you could put 1,000 in, that to me is really interesting. And I think you will see developers or other people who don't necessarily either, part of what digital currency was all about, the ICOs, was we can bypass the VCs. And I think that has changed. The VCs add a lot of value, but there's also costs associated with that value. Likewise, in real estate development or other asset buildings, will you contribute to be a builder of a bridge that has a toll booth where you're getting some percentage of it? So I think the ability to basically, in a sense, decentralize ownership, you'll still have that centralized authority, but literally everybody could contribute and diversify their asset base, et cetera. I think that's a very interesting possibility. Well, there's a lot of regulatory issues with it, but I think for me, that's where I'm kind of curious.
That's exactly where we're going with Ultra. Like, Ultra enables that technically, but it's the regulatory side that is, slowing that down, and to some extent, people's understanding of how to demand. But
when you think about something as big as sort of real estate and that sort of thing, though, I mean, one question is, it's all right decentralizing ownership. How do you decentralize expenses and costs associated with that? Like, that's a huge challenge, that I haven't seen. But again, I think that's the evolution of this.
I don't think you have to. I think what I would say is you have that central, let's just take the landlord. The landlord does it, but instead of having, the traditional investment has 100 LPs. This would have 100,000 LPs, that type of thing. Again, there's regulatory issues, there's cost structures, things of that nature. But I think that day will come, and that's what I'm hoping for.
yeah, I mean, it's automated, and then you can execute instantly once you pass some barrier, right? KYC or...
Yeah.
Once you're in the club, you could act.
And for me, another area I think that it's interesting, I mean, coming back to the earlier panel discussion, which was, security tokens and the concerns around digital securities. I don't still see a solution where, the voting and the tokenomics is quite solved in the concept of a traditional company. And that, I know you can do it in LLC structures, and I touched upon it again, but again, that sort of the governance around these things and the cost sharing around these things and that blowing that ownership up by trillions, how do you manage all that? How do we as lawyers draft those documents? How do we draft documents for electronic exchanges, digital assets exchanges that don't have international standards? I mean, it's a real whole new world. So again, super fun, very lucrative, but no, I'm just joking. But really, really challenging as well.
Well, I mean, lucrative is a relative term, but it is generating a lot of wealth in the world right now. So you can say it in many ways. Matt, any thoughts on this?
Only to say that, I think the idea of the democratization of things like art, etc., is certainly something that we've been looking at, not necessarily art, but I think the interesting thing is the use of the word democratization is, it's great to talk about entry, but then people then focus on what about exit? How does that look like? Is it a democracy that we all have to agree to get rid of the art? We can swap and change pieces out. And it's going to be interesting to see where those trends go. And it's exciting.
Well, I think this is why we had a session on governance earlier, because I think once you get deep into when we were building Ultra, we went deep into asset tokenization, and then we realized that for successful, diverse asset tokenization, you need to have governance. So when you issue that art piece, what are the exit terms? How do you manage payouts? What happens if the art dies? And so then you end up with legal frameworks for terms and conditions and clauses that get attached to the token that ideally a person could refer back to in a repository. So I do think some of that's being addressed, but it just makes for a very long kind of system. Okay, we're going to go to coffee here in a minute, and then we're going to come back for a really exciting session that's actually all about you and your own personal development. So after coffee, I hope you'll come back. But before we break, I want to ask you, these are some of the best legal minds in blockchain, right? And fortunately here in Bermuda, but also from the US. So I'm going to give you guys a kind of crazy hypothetical, and I'm going to see if you guys can give me a legal explanation or a legal framework for this. So, IBM, Microsoft, and others have been working really hard on quantum. And Google just announced a week or two ago some pretty big developments in terms of quantum computing. So we are really 5 years away from wider spread quantum. And quantum, for those of you who don't know, enables something to exist and not exist at the same time. And so when we get to quantum blockchain, it's almost certain from people deep in the industry that quantum's first real use will actually be in blockchain, because the security race is so strong, and the mining race, especially for minting things like Bitcoin, is so strong that it's blockchain that will first find a practical use for quantum. And so I want to present a scenario that you have essentially a quantum asset, right? I think within 5 years we'll have the first quantum assets. So from a legal and also a physics standpoint, this asset would exist and not exist at the same time. How do we fit an asset that doesn't actually exist into a legal framework?
Is there a right to it?
Okay.
I think I'd probably take the view that they net out.
Well, quantum, it'll be a probability. So there might be a 60% probability that it exists and a 40% probability that it doesn't. And in every given moment in time, it may exist or not exist. I mean, China just teleported stuff to the moon, right, through teleportation. And it was actually a real atomic particle, right? So we're doing teleportation now, but it doesn't exist. It sort of exists.
Is it?
Grant?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think you're talking about something that is so hard to fit into the existing framework. I think, again, I look at it from the regulatory perspective. So the regulators will find a regulation that applies if something goes wrong. And it can, like in a truly decentralized, press the button, you walk away from it. There are arguments that you're not responsible for it. But even then, the regulators will say, if you knew this would happen, you are responsible for it. And typically, there's emails that show about what you knew would happen. So I think likewise in this context, from a regulatory perspective, If it goes south, if someone benefits from it and they can trace it back, there will be some type of repercussions for that person that presses the button, in a sense.
Okay, I think this might be the first place in the world that we've discussed the legal ramifications of quantum assets. So
Cheers
remember
for that,
this moment when in 2030 we have our quantum teleporters. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining
You're
us.
welcome.